it's on.
Okay.
So there we go. So we're cooking. Now we're looking at Paul's letter to the Romans, and and by me saying that, I've already told you who, and it's Paul. And just in just a couple of sentences, what do we know about Paul?
He wanted to go to Rome.
Okay, wanted to go to Rome, and never been there.
Yeah.
He wanted desperately to preach.
Wanted to go to Rome to preach the gospel. Okay, that's his goal. And what's going on in the Roman church that becomes interesting?
The Jews are coming back.
Okay, we got Jews coming back to Rome at about this time. And so we've had a Gentile church with no Jews. Mm-hmm. And all of a sudden we have Jewish Christians coming back to the Roman church. And as it is with every group that starts to mix, you have
Conflict.
a little division and conflict, because the way we've done it isn't the way
They
you do it, and the way what we believe about ourselves isn't the way you see us, and all of a sudden you have these little conflicts, and it becomes really important when you're talking about particularly Jews and Jews with Christianity. And it becomes really pertinent kind of for us now, because some of the questions the Galatian Roman Christians had, I think are the same, a lot of questions that modern Christians have about how is God dealing with the Jews, therefore how do we deal with Jews? And that's really what is kind of motivating, part of the motivation in Paul's letter. Now, one of the things I've told you is Paul is a plotter, and his style is very meticulous. So he develops points very slowly. Now they're incredibly well developed, but he doesn't develop them fast. And he anticipates questions. And we'll see in what we're looking at today. He anticipates questions, and he'll even put questions in the work. Just throw in a question. And I think part of that is his anticipating a question that may come from the crowd, and then he answers. So he offers a question, then he answers it himself, as though somebody in the group he was talking to asked it and he's responding. And Paul does that a lot. Sometimes when he does, and we'll see it in what we're looking at today, it's kind of a diversion a little bit from what he's writing. So he's writing this point, and then he, having made this point, it's like he anticipates, okay, I've made the point, but I think somebody may be asking these questions. And so he kind of moves a little away from the point and starts answering these questions, and then goes back to his main, what he's trying to develop. Now, if, as a plotter, Paul wants to preach the gospel in Rome, and he tells us what the gospel is. It's salvation. It's the gospel of salvation. It involves righteousness, which is a key word for Paul. It involves faith, which is another key word for Paul. And in order to justify him going to Rome to preach the gospel, what does at least Paul feel he needs to establish before he does anything else?
The reason why he's there.
The reason why he needs to come. And because if there's no reason for him to preach the gospel in a Christian church, that already has a gospel, then his coming is irrelevant. Now, if I were going to do it, if I were going to go, this wouldn't even cross my mind. I just go and do it anyway. Just kind of, that's what I'm going to do. But Paul is far more meticulous than me. He wants to make sure he establishes the idea that the people in Rome need to hear this gospel that involves faith, this gospel that involves salvation, this gospel that involves righteousness.
And they would almost have to allow him to come and preach in your church. Right?
Well, that's right. They would, right, that they would, but he knows people in the Roman church, because at the end he says, say hello to, and then he lists a whole bunch of people. So he knows people in the church, and the church would appear to be influenced by him, because although he presents a theology, it's not like he does in the Corinthian church. You got to stop doing this and start doing this, or you got to stop believing him and start believing him. He doesn't do that kind of thing like as a church in that kind of turmoil. So they seem to believe what Paul believes, even though he's never been there. He does feel he needs to justify going to Rome and preaching. And so how does he begin, and that's where we've started, how does he begin to justify
Well, he
this
tries
trip
to
in Rome?
first say that he's just going to preach to the Jews, that they need.
Well, even before the Jews, because you're right. Now you're in the passage we're looking at. Before that, we're still reviewing. As you look at chapter 1, he presents this. And then so I want to preach in Rome. Well, what would justify this trip? Well, you need to hear, because the people in Rome need to hear it.
The good
right?
news.
And they need to hear the good news. And he starts talking about the people who need to hear the good news. And he starts by identifying.
Civilized, educated, or uncivilized and uneducated.
Right, so everybody needs it, right? And when he starts talking about groups in particular that need, for one, he says that we need to hear it because we're sinners. That we are sinners. And Paul says at the core of human sin, do you remember what, and this will go back to over and over again, for Paul, what's at the core of human sin? In fact, I think for Paul, sin can all kind of be reduced to this one thing.
Unbelief.
It's not unbelief. Well, unbelief is caused by this. So is unbelief part of sin? Well, sure it is. But there's a cause underneath it. What does Paul see at the core of human sin? And this is, to understand Paul, this is really important, because everything he works on is based on this assumption about sin. We are, and sin is involved with limitations and all this kind of thing, but sin has one sort of issue that's sort of within us.
Darkness?
Well, he would say this is. Remember, he says in chapter 1 that people started to worship idols. The creature rather than the creator. That becomes at the core of human sin. Now, his view of sin is really broader than, and we'll get into that because we haven't really dealt with it yet. But for Paul, at the core of human sin, or how we see sin, I guess that's better, because it's not sin itself, it's how we see it in human beings, is idolatry. That's at the core of human sin. And that's why I need to preach the gospel, because people are sinners. Well, he starts to establish that this idolatry affects us all by talking about the easiest group to say is affected by idolatry, and those would be
Unbelievers.
What kind of unbelievers? Pagan. Yeah, pagan unbelievers in Rome. The ones that are running around worshiping sticks and bushes and statues and that kind of thing. I mean, it's easy to say, they're committing idolatry because they are committing idolatry. They are worshiping.
It's obvious.
Yeah, it's obvious. And everybody in the church would say amen. So they're worshiping idols. And Paul says that this idolatry that these pagan Romans have engaged in, the result of the idolatry is that some relationships have been broken. And we talked about 3 of them. What are the 3 relationships that have been broken by them worshiping the creature rather than the creator? They have a broken relationship with God, because they're not worshiping God anymore.
Yeah.
They have a broken relationship with
Each other.
I think of nature. That's why he talks about naturally, and he uses homosexuality as an example. But he could use others, but it's a broken relationship with nature. And then you've got a broken relationship with one another. Community. You become envious. You become boastful. You become, all those wonderfully horrible things that, exist in community. It's not a person alone in a room. It affects how you live with one another. So you have these 3 broken relationships, which is the result of idolatry. And he also talks about the wrath of God, because these are idol worshipers. They've chosen to worship idols instead of worshiping the Creator. And what is the wrath of God? And again, this is important for us to file away. What does Paul describe as the wrath of God? What does God do as a result of what they've chosen to do?
Let them do what they
They
want.
let them do it. You know, they go ahead and let them do it. That's what God does. So the wrath of God becomes God saying, go.
Indifferent.
Yeah, go and do it. And removing protection. You know, so you go ahead and do it, and you pay the consequences. You make the choice, you pay the consequences. And that's what he sees as this wrath of God. Now, that's something else to keep in mind, because all of these themes he's going to come back to in the letter. And you kind of have to file them away, because when he comes back to them, he's going to kind of assume that you remember these bits and pieces. And when we get to them, we'll talk about it. But this is what else was it that Paul establishes early on?
Grace and peace.
Well, we'll get to. It's not coming. It'll come in a little bit. But anyway, so we've got, so he's talking about the pagans, right? And God has let them do it, and they are doing it, and they're paying the consequences. Now, he's preaching that to a church, right? And I think we can assume that the people in the church in the first century we're doing the same thing people in the church right now would do if I stood up and preached a sermon about how horrible certain groups are.
They'll make you feel that you're better than them.
Yeah, that if I did that, I can guarantee I would get a few amens. And somebody would come and shake my hand and say, that's what we need. We need to preach about them, because they are what's destroying us. Good job. And in the beginning of chapter 2, what does Paul say?
Not to pass judgment.
Bango! Everybody who said amen as the guy was reading that, what are you doing?
Condemning yourself.
Why are you condemning yourself?
Because you're judged by the...
You are doing what God is supposed to do.
Yeah.
You are putting yourself as judge, which means you're committing idolatry too, because you're doing what?
Thinking you're
God's
God.
job.
You're taking jobs, God. You're worshiping yourself.
Self.
You're worshiping yourself. So don't blame the guys that are running around worshiping sticks and bushes and say, oh, they're the idolaters, they're the problem. Man, when you start worshiping yourself and start casting judgment on them, you become your own God.
Yeah.
My goodness gracious. And understand when he's doing that, because remember, he shifts from third person, we said that,
Yeah.
to second person, you. He's talking about the people in the church. He isn't talking about moral Gentiles who aren't Christians. He's talking about Christians, because he's talking about you. He's not talking to another group of them. He's talking about the people in that church are sinners too. Now, that's not going to be a shock, because when we get to the 7th chapter, he's going to say, I'm a mess. End of the 7th chapter, Paul's going to say, Lord have mercy, you've read everything I've written, but I am a train wreck when you get right down to it. So, Paul isn't going to say that when you are Christians, you have risen above. He's saying right here, Christians need to hear the gospel, because you're worshiping idols too. Now, he kind of brings this group in at the end, and we'll talk about them today, at the end of his sort of exposition on why Gentile Christians need the gospel, because they're idol worshipers too. He introduces the third group, because he seems to see three groups, the pagan Gentile, the Gentile Christians, and then he brings in who?
Jews.
The Jews. And he doesn't seem to bring in, it's not just Jewish Christians, because he seems to be dealing with just the Jews. Now, one of the things I found interesting, we'll get there. And in fact, when we look at chapter 2, verse 11, and that was the last verse we looked at last time, Paul makes a statement, a powerful, powerful statement that should cause a chill to go through every Gentile spine.
Doesn't show favoritism.
Doesn't show favoritism. So that's kind of scary, and I think right here, Paul wants his audience to be a little scared, that God is not, just because you're a Christian, God's not going to show partiality to you. He really isn't. And if you worship idols, you're going to broken relationship with God, broken relationship with nature, broken relationship with one another. That's going to be the consequence, and you see it in your church. So no partiality, but we still got one group hanging out there that probably would see itself as
Better?
benefits, a beneficiary of God's partiality, and they would be the Jews, because the Jews are what?
Chosen people.
His chosen people. So Paul's got to deal with what is God dealing with the Jews, and he's going to really hit that hard in 9, 10, and 11. But right now he's introducing, because remember, he wants to establish, I need to come to Rome because you in Rome need to hear the gospel. Now the pagans know it, now the Gentile Christians know it, now the Jews need to know it. And that's what he starts talking about in verse 12. Because what does Paul say about sin? And he really hasn't, he's talked about this idolatry being the issue, but he really hasn't explored in depth what sin is, and he will. What does he say about sin, particularly as it relates to the Jews and something the Jews value?
Law.
Because it's about law. And what does he say about sin and the law?
But it written on their hearts and their consciences.
Okay, and that's really interesting, because he makes the statement in verse 12.
If you
What?
sin apart from the law, you perish apart from the law. And if you sin with the law, you're judged by the law.
You're judged by the law. Okay. So the question is then, and Paul will anticipate it, somebody can raise a hand and say, Paul, why? I mean, how does that work? How can God hold people accountable for something they don't know? You know, if I don't know the speed limit, how can you give me a ticket for speeding? You know?
Paper pen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're going to get a ticket for speeding. I'm not sure that. I don't know.
Not knowing is no excuse to this.
Yes, the ignorance of the law, and that's kind of what he's saying here. You know, if you're apart from the law, you're still going to in sin. You're still going to be judged. If you sin, but you know the law, you're sinning under the law. And how does God? And this is going to Paul's going to again develop this, because he doesn't leave any point undeveloped. So he's going to work on this later in the letter. How does Paul seem to regard the law? So he's made this statement that if you are apart from the law, you're going to be judged in sin, you're going to be judged apart from the law. If you're under the law, you're going to be judged under the law. How does God, for Paul, at least in Paul's mind, how does God regard the law?
He says it's basically baked into your human consciousness.
Okay, the law is part of us. What's that relationship between law and righteousness? And he hasn't developed righteousness much either yet. Okay, that it's not
to be righteous.
It is not just hearing. You know, it's not just hearing the law. You have to do it. Now that sort of sounds like one of those duh statements. You know, but he's going to go back to the Jews, because they seem to think that having the law makes them righteous, makes them special, becomes a sign of their righteousness. So God gave them the law. But Paul says having the law, in fact, may not be a good thing, because if you don't obey it, you know, you're in worse shape than if you didn't have it at all. You know, because that's going to be the basis of your judgment. So Paul says right here, and he really needs to do that, because he's again trying to show why the Jews need to hear this gospel, even though they're God's chosen people, that having the law isn't enough. God considers righteousness, and Paul defines righteousness as what? We mentioned it earlier. For Paul, what is righteousness? And this is a little different, very different than how Matthew uses the word dikaios, righteousness. Paul sees righteousness as relationship. So a righteous person is in
Relationship with God.
right relationship with God. A right relation. Paul will say everybody's in relationship with God. Some relationships are
Good, some
are
aren't.
right and some are not. Yeah. And so because God establishes relationship is how we respond. And some relationship is right and some are wrong. And that's what he means by righteousness. So righteousness is not just obedience. Although here he's saying that it involves obedience, but if you have that right relationship with God, you're going to do what? You're going to obey. But the relationship is what's most important, and that's what he's going to work on later. And so that seems to be the basis. It's this righteousness. Now, in verse 14, to whom does he turn?
The Gentiles.
Now he turns to the Gentiles, and everybody he's writing to is Gentiles, so they can identify. And now this is when he says what? About the Gentiles, because the Gentiles establishes right from the first that the Gentiles do not have what?
The law.
They do not have the law. So he's telling those Gentiles that you do not have the law. Now that's not a huge point, but that's relatively important. Because when we look at, and again, this is I caution you not to use Acts to understand Romans. Because in Acts, Paul seems to have no trouble with Gentiles being under certain laws. Certain laws. Because remember, the Apostolic Council came up with 5 rules that all Christians should obey, and 3 of them are dietary laws. They're the dietary laws, which you can and cannot eat. One of which is you can't eat meat with blood in it, which means Christians should keep kosher. You should eat kosher. That's what it says in Galatians, and Paul said, that's fine. Here, he's not saying that. He's saying the Gentiles, you don't have the law. You don't have any law. And Paul is not going to introduce the idea, well, your people have written laws and you have to obey them and you're going to be judged by them. What he'll say instead is, you don't have the law written down, right? But you do have what?
The principles.
You have the principles implanted in you. So you know what is right and wrong. It's something inside of you.
When you follow the principles, you reap the benefits.
Yeah. And if you don't,
You don't get benefits.
you don't get the benefit. In fact, you get punishment and accountability when you break the
So
principle.
ignorance is no excuse.
That's exactly, he's already sort of established that. And he's already established this idea that this is something implanted, because remember in the first chapter, he said, why did he say no one can be excused for not knowing
Because
God?
when you look at nature, you see
You see God. You can see God all around you. And pagans can see that just like believers.
Yeah.
So you can't get a mulligan by not being a Jew or not having the Old Testament to tell you who God is. You should be able to see God well enough to know that you don't run around worshiping sticks and bushes and trees, nor do you run around worshiping yourself. You should know that because you can see nature. He's saying the same thing about the law. God has implanted in each of us kind of what words would we use to describe that?
morality.
Yeah, a sense of morality, a
Sense of guilt.
sense of guilt. I'm thinking of like a conscience, that we all carry around this conscience. And, historically, we could say Paul probably is right, because when you compare ancient laws, like the Code of Hammurabi, which is an ancient law, a little earlier than the Jewish law, they got the same principles. You can't run around killing one another, and live in a society. You can't steal somebody else's stuff. You can't commit adultery. These were laws that weren't distinctively Jewish laws. These were laws that every culture, society had. And Paul would say, I think if you asked him, well, duh, because God has implanted a sense of morality into all of us. So we all have a sense of we know what's right and wrong. We don't need a law saying thou shalt not murder to prevent me from shooting people, because I know running around shooting people is
Wrong.
It's wrong. Duh. And that's what Paul's saying. And therefore, if I run around shooting people, if I'm a Gentile,
I still pay the consequences.
I'm going to pay the consequences. But Paul pushes it even further, because he says it's not just your actions that God judges.
It's your thoughts.
It's your thoughts. It's internal. Why would he do that? Why would, and remember what Paul's trying to establish. Why would it be important to say it's not just the actions that are important, it's the inner thoughts that are also important? What is Paul trying to do here?
He's showing us that because of the fall, we don't think right.
We need the gospel. We need the gospel. Now, we don't know what the gospel is yet because Paul's not going to start talking about it until 3:21. So we don't know what it is. But that's his point. Everybody in this room needs to hear the gospel. And if he says, well, God only judges by action, I can say, well, I haven't done anything. Like the rich young ruler. I've obeyed the law since I was a child. And I don't think he was being a hypocrite. I think he had obeyed the law since he was a child. I haven't broken the law. So certainly that doesn't apply to me. What Paul is saying, well, because since God judges inner thoughts, if you've ever thought something bad, then you're guilty. And it's not to make you feel bad, it's to prepare you to hear the gospel, the good news, because the gospel is going to be liberation, is going to be freedom from that.
Well, everybody, I know, me too, sometimes you'll see something and your thoughts won't be as Christian as they should be maybe, and then you realize what you're doing, so you kind of say, no, I'm not going to do that, Isn't that like a normal sort of thing?
Yes. And I think Paul would say, in fact, I think Paul would say that is unbelievably normal. It also shows that every normal person needs to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. Every normal person needs to hear it. Because the fact that you're making, that's good, because he's going to develop this later. The fact that you're having to make that decision, for Paul, that's going to show enslavement to sin. And I think, although he doesn't do it explicitly, he does it a little bit in 1 Corinthians 15. One of the things he'll say about the fall, or I think Paul is consistent with what Paul says, the fall, is that the fall forced us to have to make the decision. That now we're bound to decide what is right and what is wrong. It's not freedom. We see that as freedom. Now I get to choose. Paul says that's slavery. The fact that I am constantly having to choose what is right and what is wrong means I'm a slave. Paradise is not having to choose because
just doing it.
That's right, because evil is no longer a possibility. That's paradise. Slavery is every single act. You have to think what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what's going to help somebody, what's going to hurt. Everything we do, we're bound to make that decision, which Paul, I think, would say shows we're slaves to sin. That we are absolutely enslaved to having to make that decision. It's not, Paul doesn't see that as freedom at all. That's not freedom at all, that's slavery. But that's coming later. You're going exactly where Paul's going to go. But right now he's still just trying to establish that everybody needs to hear this. The fact that you're set free from the slavery. Okay, so if you have the law, you need to obey the law, right? Now, verse 17, right? He goes back to who?
The Jews.
Goes to the Jews. Now, one of the things I was looking, and this morning I went and checked my Greek, because I expected this to be plural, this you to be plural. See, you Yankees are, you don't got it, you don't have it right.
I mean, like you
You don't have it right. Because we in the South, if I'm talking to you, I say
Yeah.
you. No, I'll say you. If I'm talking to you, I say y'all. Well, in you Yankees, I mean you, how do you know? How do you know? That's why.
Well, we just say all of you.
Well, that's why. That's when you're talking about a lot of people. You say all y'all. That's a huge group.
Okay.
It's all y'all. Just a small intimate group is y'all. Yeah, but that and that's why Jesus was a Southerner, and he was born in southern Palestine, So I mean, he truly was, and
So we have to interpret what God says here as y'all.
absolutely. Well, sometimes. Now, that's not the case here, though,
Okay.
because the you in 17 is singular, which makes it I find that very interesting. I don't know that I can explain why. But if he had used plural, then he's talking about all. I expected plural that he's talking about all Jews, but he isn't. He's talking about individuals. So interesting. He used a plural you earlier. He used a singular you here, and I'm not sure I know why. So I don't want to even suggest
Well,
it.
if you say, if I think of myself as a Christian, I would say you as a Christian.
Right.
And have these characteristics. He's saying, you as a Jew, you have these characteristics individually.
Right. Yeah, and that's what he certainly is doing. He's pulling it down to the individual, not to the corporate group, which is actually harder, pulling it down to the individual, than it is, because you can always say, well, you're doing it, but he's not, so you can't say all of you are doing it. But he doesn't do that here. Okay, but he pulls it down to Jews, right? So he turns his attention to the Jews. Now, what does he say about, what is he saying about, or what might the Jews, even before we think about what he's saying, what might the Jews be saying about themselves? What would we assume the Jews, how do they see themselves? How would a Jew see himself?
They see themselves as God's people.
Okay, a Jew, if I'm a Jew, I see myself as God's chosen people, one of God's chosen people.
I mean, I have a better relationship
Well,
than we do because I am a Jew.
Well, this sounds better if you say it in Hebrew. What I'm about to say sounds better if you say it in Hebrew, but I don't know the Hebrew word, so I'm going to have to say it in English. Duh. Yeah, of course I'm better than you, because I have, and why do I know I'm one of God's chosen people?
The law.
Because I've got the law. Because I have.
Therefore, I'm better than you.
I have the law. And as a result, I have this tangible symbol that I am better than you, because God has given me the law. Now understand, Paul's already undercut the law just a little while ago, because he's already said having the law means you got to obey it. So having the law and not obeying it is worse than not having it. So he's already said that having the law, and now he goes back to the Jews have the law. And he's talking about I as a Jew have the law, therefore I know that I am
Better than you.
better. I am God's chosen. I am part of God's people, right? And then Paul starts talking about, as a result of the law, of having, or me being special, how might I see myself? And he starts talking about that
Superior to everybody.
in 29. How do I start seeing myself?
Oh, being circumcised.
Like at 29, I am he starts what's called a conditional sentence here. And in English, a conditional sentence is, does anybody know what a conditional sentence is?
If this is true, then that's true.
If then. That's a conditional sentence. There was a Broadway musical. That was the title of it, If Then. If then and the first part after the if is called the protasis. It establishes this possibility. If this possibility exists, then this is going to be the result. So if this happens, if I go to the store, I'll buy a gallon of milk. That's a conditional. If I don't go to the store, I'm not buying a gallon of milk. But if I go, I'll do this. That's an if-then sentence. And that's what he starts here. In Greek, this is part of grammar, and this is what he's doing. So he starts all those things that sound, when you read them, let's see. You are sure that you are the guide to the blind, a light to those in darkness, a corrector of foolishness, teacher of children, having in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. As you read that, Do you think Paul meant it when he was saying that about a Jew?
No, he's just been sarcastic.
He's being sarcastic. But I want you to notice it's in a conditional sentence. Because he starts the sentence by saying,
If you're convinced.
if that's how you see yourself,
But here,
if that's how you see yourself,
but it also says, why don't you teach yourself?
then that's the then. If this is how you see yourself as being God's gift to God, God's gift to humanity, if that's how you see yourself, boom, verse 21, then
Why aren't you doing
Yeah,
it?
do you not teach yourself?
why don't you teach yourself? Why don't you teach yourself?
He's saying you gotta walk the walk, not
He's-
just talk the talk.
He's saying if this, and he does it in such, almost a modern way, because this is what we kind of expect a modern a writer to do. He's being really sarcastic. If you think you're such hot stuff, then why don't you act like it?
No, he's asking the same questions to him, but is he doing it himself? When he's,
Yeah, if you think
He
you're so
does.
smart, why are you asking such dumb questions? That's what he's doing. And instead of saying, after the then you should listen to your own advice, he asks a question which makes them feel
this big.
about this big.
Yeah.
About this big. I mean, this is a good this guy knows how to write. He knows what he's doing here. Of what does he accuse them?
You steal.
He accuses them of what? Yeah, you preach against stealing.
But you steal.
But it's
You
interesting.
rob temples.
He doesn't say you preach against stealing and yet you steal.
And you
No,
rob from
but do
temples.
you?
Yeah, but he asks the question. That's wonderful. So it leaves it to, by asking the question, it leaves it
You have to answer the question.
you have to answer it.
You have to
This is good stuff. You preach against stealing, but do you steal?
I like that.
Do you, Patty?
1 and 23.
no. But that's what he's
I don't
doing.
think so.
That's what he's doing. But he doesn't leave it, right? He says,
Are you faithful?
do you commit adultery? You preach against adultery. Do you commit adultery? You preach about idols. Now you could say, no, I don't steal. No, I do not commit adultery. You abhor idols. Do you rob temples?
How's that the same? I mean, what I'm saying, how is abhorring idols robbing a temple?
Well, what are you doing when you rob in a temple?
You're dishonoring it.
Well, you're dishonoring. What on a very concrete level are you doing? Why are you robbing a temple?
Because
You're taking what out of a temple? If you're robbing a temple, what are you taking out of a temple? You're taking, valuables, right? You got no problem melting those idols down, for the gold. You got no problem doing that. But you say you hate them, and yet you profit by them. Doesn't that sound strange?
Sounds like stealing.
Sounds like stealing to me. You boast in the law.
what's that word you use for people who two-faced?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Oh, I'd never do that. Ooh, that would be bad. Yeah, okay. Let's go with that. You boast in the law. Oh, I'm so special because I have the law. That's great.
And there you are making an idol out of yourself and breaking the law.
You, in a sense, you've made what into an idol?
Me.
You could be you, yeah. You also made the law an idol. Because you have no trouble worshiping the law. But you don't obey it. You don't obey the law. You don't do it. And then, as we've said before,
If that's a Christian, I don't want any part of it.
a very Pauline thing to do. He uses a gar, starts verse 24 with a gar. In fact, what you're doing is so bad. What you're doing in this is so bad. It's been written what?
Insulting God?
Well, not only are you insulting God,
But
You
if
blast
that's what being a Christian is, I don't want any part of it.
Uh-huh. And who is saying that?
The Gentiles.
Gentiles. You are so bad that the Gentiles think it's awful. What you're doing is so contrary to God, it appalls and embarrasses the Gentiles. They think you're bad. I read an article this last week. They're going to do at the Super Bowl a lot of advertising. A group, an organization has bought commercial time. And the goal is to put Jesus in a more positive light. Promote Jesus.
They're
in a
gonna let them
positive-
do it, actually?
If you buy advertising, if you pay the money, they'll let a Satanist. If a Satanist can earn the money, they'll let anybody buy advertising time. And this is what they're doing. They're going to do that. And the article, and I found the article interesting, and it made me a little uncomfortable. And the writer of the article said, "Is Jesus really the problem? Is the negative impression of Jesus that a lot of people in our society seem to have, is that the problem of Jesus or those who follow
Those who
Jesus?"
follow, that would be the answer.
And you can do all you want promoting Jesus as a wonderful figure, but unless you deal, if the problem is with the people who follow, then that's not going to help.
It doesn't change Jesus' image.
That's not going to help. That's
to the
right.
general
And this is what he's saying. The Gentiles think you're ungodly. You're an embarrassment to God because the Gentiles recognize it. Now,
Well, it says right here, if it's God's name is blasphemed among Gentiles, it's because of you.
that's exactly right.
Is this the singular or the y'all?
What's that?
The you?
I'd have to check on that. I really do. Would have to check on it. He's been pretty consistent using singular. So in the other thing, but I didn't check that particular verse.
It would be interesting because if it's a you all, then there's no individual responsibility. But
Right.
if it's a you,
Then it is.
then each of us bears the responsibility of representing Christ properly.
He's been pretty consistent in using singular, but I didn't go that far. But I'm guessing he didn't shift. But if he did, that becomes really significant. Now, again, Paul is a plotter. So the law, he says, is that thing that the Jews claim makes them special. But it really isn't. Because in verse 25, he hits now the thing the Jews will claim makes them special.
Circumcision.
And that's going to be circumcision. Because the law goes back to who?
The Jews.
The law goes back to Moses.
yeah.
Circumcision goes back to Abraham. Goes back to Abraham. And so circumcision becomes the sign that you're a Jew. Now understand, in the ancient world, the Jews weren't the only people that circumcised. That was kind of a Middle Eastern thing. But the Jews saw that as the sign of the covenant they had with God is circumcision, which the Gentiles didn't.
And it's not always just like a physical thing, it's in your heart.
Well, the Jews saw it as a physical thing. That's what the Jews would say. If you want to know that you're one of God's people, you have that physical sign. Like a tattoo or something else that you can, or a card, a social security card shows that you're a citizen of the United States. That becomes the physical sign that you are what you claim to be, and circumcision is a sign that you're a Jew. But you're right, Shelley, what Paul will do is, because he's going to do the same thing with circumcision that he did with the law, right? Because if you're circumcised, you should what? If you're circumcised, if you're really a Jew, a circumcised Jew, you should be obeying the law, right? Mm-hmm. But if you break the law,
then circumcision is no value.
is irrelevant. And he talks about it's uncircumcision. Well, he doesn't mean physically it's changed, but you're not if circumcision makes you a Jew, but you don't obey Jewish law, then what?
It's just something you've done to your body.
Yeah, you're not a Jew. Mm-hmm. You're not living like a Jew. Therefore you can't, just because you're circumcised doesn't mean that you are Jewish. Now, the problem is, if I say that, I have got to change, if I want to make sure, if I'm Paul and a plotter, I've got to make sure that I kind of change the definition of circumcision. And he changes the definition of circumcision by saying, it's your heart that's circumcised, it's not your body, your external body, it's internal.
Yeah.
You know, I find that interesting because regular circumcision is an outward sign. But circumcision of the heart is more about your relationship with God rather than anything physical. And so Paul making this shift says it's more about the relationship that nobody can see except by what they observe.
Right.
But it's not, they can't tell you're a Christian by the color of your hair, or, you know, the ring through your nose or whatever,
Right.
you know, other outward symbol
Right.
that they would do that.
Right, or wearing a cross, or having a cross necklace, a necklace with a cross on it, or carrying a Bible. All right. Those are external. Now, we don't want to lose touch with the fact that all of this is to establish that we all need to hear the gospel. That he isn't saying anything positive yet. He really isn't. None of this should be read as a positive. You know, this is just to knock, the slats out from underneath different groups. He's done it with the pagan Gentiles. He's done it with the Christian Gentiles. He's now doing it with the Jews. Don't think you're special because you got the law. Because you got the law, you better obey it. Don't think you're special because you're circumcised. Because if you really were circumcised, you'd be obeying the law, which you're not doing. We've already established you're not doing. So all of this is to kind of eliminate these reasons a person could stand up and say, I'm special, I'm okay. I'm okay, you're okay. So knocking those slats out from underneath Jews. Now, when we get into chapter 3, he asks, this is, I think is a little one of these Pauline, which Paul does from time to time. He sort of says, time out. Let's take a breather. Let me answer some questions. And because what he does is he asks some questions. Yeah, he starts asking questions,
Yeah.
right? As though, because he's not talking to a group, he's writing a letter, as though he's saying, okay, we're going to stop here for a minute and I'll entertain a few questions. Oh, in the back, what's your question? Well, then what's the advantage of being a Jew? If Paul had just said, the Jews need to hear the gospel because they're a mess, because it doesn't matter whether you're circumcised or not. If you're not obeying the law, you're not acting like a Jew. And if you're not acting like a Jew, circumcision doesn't mean anything. Then somebody in the back of the room says, Paul.
Well, why bother being a Jew?
Yeah, then is there any, or maybe more pertinent, what is the value of circumcision? Now, that's a powerful question. Because if Paul's answer, Paul would seem to be saying what? In what he just wrote. You could certainly there is no advantage of being a Jew. And circumcision doesn't mean one hill of beans. Now, if that's the answer Paul gives, then what is he saying about God?
That God was wrong and took them as a chosen people.
Everything after Abraham is wrong. God's changed his mind. When God has now changed his mind. And that God is changeable. All of a sudden you can't count on God's promises. Because if he says, it doesn't make any difference whether you're a Jew or not. Well, okay, what part of the Old Testament should we eliminate? Mm-hmm. Everything that says the Jews are God's people. So let's wipe all of that out. That's what the Nazis did. They really did. The German Christians in Germany, they kind of purged not only the Old Testament, which means pretty much eliminated, they purged the New Testament of anything reference to Jews being positive in any sense.
And they also purged from their education of their children, generations later, that this never happened.
Oh, sure, sure.
The Holocaust never
Sure.
took
Well,
place.
this is the question, and that's why this is a powerful question. And Paul anticipates it, and how does he answer it?
Much in every way.
He says
there's a lot of advantages.
There's all kinds of advantages to being a Jew, and there's all kinds of advantages of having a circumcision. For example, good for statement. A gar statement.
They're in charge of keeping God's word.
They've got the ordinance of God. Now, what does he mean by that? That the advantage is, the advantage that he has, for example, is they have because he doesn't call them the law of God. He says
The words of God.
the words of God, or the oracles of God, or the special truth from God. He won't say law, but they're special because God did what?
He worked through them.
He worked through them. So yeah, it is special to be a Jew. Now, any other questions? So that was what. Any other questions in the back of the room?
What if someone?
Yeah, what if some are unfaithful, Paul? Will their unfaithfulness undermine? If you say God, then it is good to be a Jew because they've received these oracles. What if some Jews are unfaithful? Does that mean now what? That God isn't faithful anymore?
Yeah.
That we can nullify? And the assumption is some Jews are what?
Unbelievers.
Unfaithful, right? And how do we know that some are unfaithful?
Because they're not always talking about it. They
Yeah,
weren't.
and what's the most obvious reason that sign the Jews are unfaithful?
They don't follow the law.
Even for this Gentile, they nailed Jesus to a cross, for crying out loud. Yeah, how do you say, well, the Jews are okay, they're still special people, when they're the ones that took responsibility for killing Christ? How do you do that?
That was the hardest thing for me to think about that they're his chosen people, and yet they're the ones who wanted rid of him.
Well,
Yeah, but that's
the
right.
interesting thing is, though, that the ones that you love hurt you the most.
Sure. Well, but that's the question that they're asking. And again, this is sort of like you put it in parentheses, because he hasn't come in for a landing yet. Because these are anticipated questions from what he has just said. Well, then is God being unfaithful?
No.
If some of the Jews are unfaithful, does that mean God's not faithful to them? No. And Paul's response is, and we'll see this response again,
not at all.
Absolutely not, by no means, God forbid. It is as emphatic as it's Greek colloquialism. It's a Greek phrase that has no immediate translation into English, but it means sort of, God forbid, absolutely not. Are you stupid? What are you thinking? This is ridiculous. It's kind of this extreme, reaction. And what does he say? Why does it not impinge on God's faithfulness?
God is true and everybody else is a lie.
That's right, because God is that one constant truth, and therefore God's promises are true, right? God's promises are true. And in fact, he says, if you want to see how faithful God is, a good sign of how faithful God is, you can see in the fact that he's done what? He's remained faithful to Israel, even though Israel is unfaithful to him. That he's remained faithful. Oh, Lord, have mercy. A hand goes up in the back of the room. So God is showing his faithfulness in the fact that Israel is kind of screwed up. Now, he's going to talk about that later. So we're not worried about it now. He's going to deal with it later. Hand goes in the room and somebody says, now this is a smarty aleck in the back of the room. What does he say?
If we can be worse, can God be better?
Oh, yeah.
Will God be better?
That's right. If injustice confirms the justice of God, what then should we say? Would it be unjust for God to punish us? If we can see God's faithfulness in the lack of faithfulness in Israel, then maybe God won't punish us when we're unjust.
God forgives. God loves.
Well, that means I'm not accountable. Therefore, I can do what?
And you want.
I can do whatever I want. Often people accuse Christians, particularly Christians that believe that God is in control. We'll ask this question. Doesn't that mean I can do anything I want? And Paul's response is,
Yeah.
no. Again, the same word. Are you stupid? This is ridiculous. Because God's going to be the judge of the world. My gosh, God's going to be the judge of the world. So you can't. That's ridiculous to make that assumption. Okay. Now, how is the same question related to what? And he's continuing to push it with these questions. The same question in 7 and 8. And this he pushes even further.
Does God get more glory if I
Well,
sin more?
let's sit down and talk about this, Paul. Now, let's think about the logic here. God shows his faithfulness when Israel is most unfaithful, right? Because God's incredible faithfulness is shown by him continuing to be faithful to people who reject him. That shows that God really is
God.
faithful. You just said God is forgiving, right? If God shows his faithfulness, if Israel was faithful, that would be good. But the fact that Israel is not faithful shows just how faithful God is.
I mean, God gets angry.
Well, if I'm a good guy, I can say God shows that God is a forgiving God, right? But what if I'm really,
What if I'm
really
bad
bad?
guy?
What if
You have
I'm
to
really
forgive
bad
me all
and
that
God
much more.
is still forgiving me? Doesn't that show what? How incredibly forgiving
He
God
is.
is.
How much he loves.
So that's right. It shows how much he loves me. So wouldn't it be right for me to do what?
Evil.
Be bad.
To be as bad as I can be, because that just shows how
great God is.
God is. You look at that, and Paul's response to that is what?
That's stupid.
That's stupid. And in fact, anybody that believes that, their condemnation is deserved. If that's what you actually believed, you deserve everything you get. Understand though, when I was in Indianapolis, and this was like 25 years ago, had a young woman come into my office. She was involved in one of the campus ministries. And she said to me, she was in my church and had gone off to college that year and got involved in one of these campus ministries. And she said to me, Ed, I got a real problem. And I said, what? She said, I don't have a testimony. We have to have a testimony because we have to stand up in front of groups and give our testimony. And she said, I don't have a testimony. And I remember saying, yeah, you got a great testimony. One, you're a wonderful young woman, good family, believe in Jesus Christ, grown up in the church. Man, you know the Bible as well as almost anybody I know. You have a wonderful testimony. She said, no, I don't. To have a good testimony, you have to be really bad. You have to be really good because God has to save you from something. And she says, I've never been bad enough to have a good testimony. She says, I've never been bad enough to have a good testimony. And I sat there, my first thought was, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And then I started remembering, I don't remember anybody standing up and saying, this is my testimony. I lived in a very comfortable home, had good parents, grew up in the church, never got into trouble. My faith grew from the time I was 6, and now I believe more than I did then. But there's been nothing dramatic. And I can't think of a time I gave Jesus my life because he already had my life. I already knew it. I've never heard anybody give a testimony like that. I've heard them, I was a prostitute, I was a drug addict, I was in jail. God saved me from this, and my life changed. And all of a sudden it hit me. I know exactly what she's saying. In the group she's with, that's what you have to do. And I said, I don't know what to tell you. Because I can't tell you to make something up. Because that's lying. And that's worse. I said, I don't know what to tell you. I think your life is a good one. And your faith is a good one. And she said, okay, I'm sorry. And later I found out that she had come up with a testimony of inner thoughts. She was plagued with inner thought because she'd never done anything externally bad. So no drug, there were no track marks on her arms. She was such a good girl. So it was the inner thought. She was wrestling with these horrible inner demons, and God saved her from it because now she had a good testimony. She could stand up in front of the group.
But being able to do that shows us that it doesn't matter how good you are, you still need God to save you.
Well, there was another guy doing a presentation, and this was even longer ago, and I remember it like yesterday. And he was a minister in Alaska, and he went to a conference. And somebody came up to him, a group came up to him and said, when did you give your life to Jesus? He was a presenter at this conference. When did you give your life? He said, well, that's kind of complicated. Because I can't remember a time Jesus wasn't in my life. He's always been in my life. So I can't remember a time I said, that I was lost and now am saved. He says, it's been my whole life. That I've believed in Jesus Christ. And he said one of the people in the group that talked to him, he said, that's a shame. That's a shame. Because he didn't have a testimony. He didn't have... I find that to be a shame. And that's what Paul's saying here. Because that's the logic, is if God can love me when I'm a stinker, shouldn't I be a stinker? To show how much God loves. And Paul says, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. If you believe that, you get everything you deserve. I mean, Paul's pretty blunt here.
But why does it have to be that you committed something bad? If you've lived your life through Jesus, or Jesus through you, and you say, he's been in my life and he's guided me and this has happened and so on, what makes that not a testimony?
You know what? What makes it, according to Paul, what would make that not a testimony? What would Paul say? That becomes a sign.
You believe that you've never done anything wrong, and we all are sinners and come short of the glory of God.
That right? I think you're right. I think he'd say that's a sign of idolatry. That you would put yourself up as God. That's a good testimony. That's what God wants to hear. You're putting yourself up as God. He'd say that's a sign of idolatry. That you become the judge of a person's relationship with God. It can't be good unless you were really bad. And that's why I find that really interesting. I don't think that's a main point, but I find that interesting here. Because in verse 9 he gets back, and we can do this really fast. In verse 9 he gets back to his main point. And his main point, remember, is how can I justify coming to Rome to preach the gospel? And what is Paul's conclusion in verse 9?
That are we any better?
Yeah. What then? Are we any better?
We've already made the change.
What is the answer?
Not at all.
No. We, which is interesting, because now he includes himself with the Gentile Christians, which becomes, I like the way Paul uses person in this, because now he's including himself with them. Are we any better than these Jews he was talking about?
Nope.
Remember what I just said? We aren't. In fact, if you look at what I wrote, what conclusion do you have to come to? What does Paul say is the conclusion?
There is no one who is righteous.
There is no one who is righteous. For everybody, both Jews and Greeks, are under the power of sin. All of them. And then, if that statement weren't enough, then what does Paul do?
There is no one who understands and no
Where's
one
he
who
getting
seeks
that?
God.
Where's he getting all that? From Scripture. He's quoting the Old Testament. He's saying, don't believe I'm making this up. This is what your Scripture says. In other words, what is the human condition? What is the human condition?
Sin.
No one's good. No one's kind. No one's gentle. Everyone's a sinner.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Not even one.
Not even one. Nobody has a right relationship with God. Nobody.
Boy, I just
Have a nice day.
read 13. That was.
Well, you read 13. What does 13 say?
Their throats are open graves and their tongues practice deceit. Whew, that's pretty big.
The venom of vipers is under their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery are in their paths. Coco, don't listen to this. This is bad stuff. Okay?
And the way of peace they do not know.
That's right. Okay? There is no one, because everyone is
A sinner.
a sinner and is lost. All of us. We deserve nothing but the wrath of God. Period. Close the book. Elvis has left the building. Let's have a word of prayer. Lord God, thank you so much for giving us this time together. And, this is kind of tough. Help us recognize who we are. In the name of Christ we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Now, having said who we are, in the next verse, in 3:21, what does Paul say? Because I want you to come back. What does he say in
But now a
3:21?
righteousness from God apart from the law has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify.
So now what does he start doing in verse
Shows us how
3:21?
to be
Bring
thankful
you
to
back.
God.
Now he says, you are a mess and you are lost. But you know what?
You can come
God,
back.
well, not you, he won't even say you'll
you.
come back. He'll say, but God.
God.
And that's all we need to say is, that's us, but God. And that's what he's going to start working on. You know, this may be, therefore we all need to hear the good news. Now he's going to start doing what?
Telling us how to be right with
This,
God, become right.
this is the good news. Yeah, this is the good news, you know, that I'm going to share with you. So, this is good news. So you got to come back, you know, to hear good news. Okay?
Oh, now I know why Ben is.
Yeah, that's right. That's what I told. That's what we were picking noodles and that's when Peg. She said, you know, we're not going to be here on Wednesday. I said, okay. And Jody the same way, because she said, I'm not going to be here in a couple of weeks, but I want to get back. And I said, well, you're missing a lot of negativity. Because, you know, it's bad. And I told Peg, man, this next week is really bad. All you have to know about this one is you're rotten. That's all you have to know, is Paul says you stink. And that's what he does. But next week he's going to start talking about, you still stink. We still stink. But.
We can learn to unstink.
Well, no, we can't. No, he's not going to even give us that.
Oh, geez.
But God can change us. And that's going to be the key. What God does is never going to be what we do. It's going to be what God does. And that's what he's going to start talking about, what God has done. And that's when the good news gets exciting.
Do you know what, when we get back to that thing about the testimony thing, okay, even if you, like, she didn't think she ever did anything bad in her life that she could stand up and say, make it a testimony. I don't care how good you are or how much you believe. There are times when you think wrong thoughts, you know, and sometimes say the wrong things, you know, but then you try to make them better.
Sure.
So, you know, that's, I just
Well, I think
that's kind of a testimony in itself. You're at least working at it.
Well, I think Paul, and I think you're right. I think that's right. And I think that's what Paul's saying. That's why he says we're all lost. You know, and he's not suggesting that we're all killing people and stealing and committing adultery. And he's not saying that. He's saying, but we're all lost because we're doing this, either big things or little things. But, you know, if you do a little thing, you know, if you're a block away, but you don't know where you are, you're still not going to get to the place.
Oh, that's me.
You know, you could be 30 miles away or 2 blocks away. You still ain't going to make it if you don't know where you're going. And that's what Paul's going to say.
Yes,
You know, and yeah. So I think Paul would agree with you. And therefore, that person needs grace, an awareness of grace. And grace is always going to be external. It's not going to be internal. It's going to be external. I think, though, with the testimony, we've all heard that you know, people standing up and giving testimonies. They're always, I was horrible. I was horrible.
It is that way. And if you were
horrible.
born into a good Christian family and they took you to the Baptist church, that was ingrained in you.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
you still have to do that. And you might accept the Lord and then kind of go off on your own again, and you have to come back again.
It may be very interesting, and I'm thinking out loud, and then y'all can go now if you can go anytime. In fact, that I just wonder if they've ever done studies. I wonder if that might cause some folks that have that really strict upbringing to kind of drift away. You know, because in their part of their background is hearing all these testimonies. I was an alcoholic. I was a drug addict. I was a thief. I was in jail. I was, you know, yada, 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 yada. All the horrible things I was. But now Jesus saved me. If that's what I hear all the time, that's salvation. That's salvation. And I'm growing up in this Baptist house where I'm not allowed to play cards or dance, you know, because it's that narrow. Maybe, you know, the only way I can be a Christian is for God to save me from something pretty bad. You know, not that I'm thinking it consciously, but that's kind of been implanted back here, that maybe I need to be kind of wild so I can come back and then be able to stand up and say, I was really wild. When I was a teenager and young adult, I was really wild. And now God brought me back home. I would like to, I'd be curious if that's something that, in terms of behavior patterns, if that's something that you see.
Well, they always used to say that you never wanted to date a preacher's boy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. PKs. You got to watch PKs. Preacher boys are wild. Preacher girls are even wilder. And we worried about Maggie. We prayed over her.
I can remember one time like I said, I was raised in a Baptist church, and then we moved up here. My dad had started a business up here. But anyways, I went back one day and the preacher says, "Oh, Barb, I didn't recognize you." I said, "Oh, good, I can get away with more." And he says, "Do you want to get away with more?" I was just kidding around. Yeah.
There are certain things you don't kid. You don't kid with a Baptist minister. But you know what? You could say it to a Presbyterian. I'd get the joke.
Yeah. But sometimes you can't always tell by looking at somebody, necessarily whether they're good or bad. They can put on a front and make you believe they are the best things on 2 feet, but it doesn't mean they are.
That's right. That's right. Ask any girl I dated.
Oh my goodness.